Jerome was ambitious. This line, which Jerome wrote after his hasty departure from Rome in 385, represents the disappointment of Jerome's high-flying hopes to mount the cathedra of the Bishop of Rome, or Pope, if you will. However close he had come to his goal, it was ironically this defeat that caused him to become a truly influential Christian writer. He settled in Bethlehem with his patroness and, so to say, ascetic common-law wife Paula, and founded a monastery, a convent, and a hospice for pilgrims. He was going to, as Grutzmacher puts it, give some splendid scientific achievements to the West. In this paper, I want to examine how Jerome's ascetic settlement in Bethlehem turned out to be the key in his success as a Christian writer. A lot of what I'm going to say is conjectural, as it's sometimes impossible to deduce hard facts. Nonetheless, I think I will be presenting more than pure guesswork. Also, as the time is quite limited, I had to cut out a lot of this study, so some points cannot be argued here in depth. Andrew Kane, who I'm glad to see here, has shown how Jerome was a master of self-representation by the use of his letters. Early on, Jerome presented himself as an ascetic of the desert, memba sacro horrida, between snakes and scorpions, tempted by the devil, struggling with visions of dancing girls. His propaganda was successful. In Bethlehem, Jerome adapted his self-presentation. It was now more based in reality, so to say. He became a monk in a cell. He became a monk in the cell who spent day and night with praying and pondering the Word of God. At the same time, Jerome led his Cenobitic community, which strove to adapt the ascetic ideal of a paradise on earth. This lifestyle was perfectly suited to attract rich benefactors who wanted to support the pauperes Christi and make themselves a treasure in heaven. Jerome had started early on in his career to build his private library. It formed the essential foundation of his scholarly work. His collection of books had also moved to Bethlehem and did not stop growing. It appears likely that Jerome entertained some kind of writing institution as a complement to his library. It may not have yet looked like an early medieval scriptorium, but Jerome had a busy writing schedule for sure. Places of book production were not unknown in antiquity. Public libraries had institutions to enlarge their collection, as can be seen in the famous Library of Alexandria. In private, the mode of circulation was used to acquire one's reading material. Space and personnel, that is, trained copyists, were needed. They were commonly found among the retinue of any wealthy Roman. So it's no surprise that a cultured Roman who became a monk did not abandon his intellectual needs, but rather adapted them into a new monastic environment. There are two terms usually used for scribes: the notarii et litterae. Jerome talks about them in various places, and he's not using a handiadioin here. They were two different types of craftsmen. To cut this short, notarius is literally a fast writer. The Greek pendant is the tachografos, whose main job was to write down what was dictated. See here, if you want, two examples which indicate their duties. Notarius had to assist with daily writing, routines, protocols, bills, personal letters, communication with administration, etc. Jerome had these around him in the monastery. The librarius, however, was a writer of books, a copyist. Sometimes these people were also called antiquari, and I'm staring with this, but let's just take it like this. But who, and that is more interesting, who were these scribes? Is it possible that they were monks in the monastery? Well, I'm cutting my argument here for time reasons to get to the juicier parts of my paper sooner, but the quick answer is this: to become a notarius, one had to master shorthand and was overall very well trained. It is probable that Jerome had to hire them from outside his monastery, but Jerome might have been able to train monks to become librarians. The development of monasteries in the West was still at its beginnings in the 30s, 80s and 90s. Jerome and Paula's community was clearly ahead among other Latin foundings. There are, however, two earlier examples one can learn something from. One is Bishop Martin's monastery in Tours, whose treatment I'm going to skip here, and the other community was that of Rufinus in Melania, on the Mount of Olives nearby Jerusalem. It is quite possible that Jerome and Paula took their community as a model. In his Apology, Rufinus writes these lines about Jerome. From them one can see that Rufinus employed monks, fratres in cellulis manentes, to write, who copied books from the library for Jerome, descripserunt. The passage is quite possibly one of the, if not the oldest testimony of Latin monastery in which monks worked as copyists. That does not mean that Rufinus can claim the title of the inventor of the monastic library scriptorium, but he is certainly one of the first who used the manpower at his disposal for his scholarly needs. And if he did so, Jerome most certainly did so too. Having your own monks tasked with writing matters was mainly a financial benefit. But about how much money are we actually talking? Let's have a look at some concrete costs of Jerome's bibliophilia here. Jerome's library was of great size. Megan Williams has shown that it was structured akin to libraries in aristocratic homes and probably larger than the library of the Villa dei Papiri in Herculaneum, possibly even bigger than the episcopal library of Caesarea. Such a monastery library was an extraordinary expensive luxury, because hundreds, if not thousands of books had their price. Roger Bagnall created a table in his book, Early Christian Books in Egypt, in which the price of a Bible is calculated in solidi. You can see it's very high, so the highest is like 14. And to put these numbers into relation, the necessary amount of money for one person to live in is 1 solidus per annum as an absolute minimum, and whereas 6 solidi provide a somewhat safe basis for life. And priests, as a side note, would earn about 25 solidi a year, a good source of income, with not much to worry about, but would have he would have to save quite a bit to buy a Bible for himself. Bagnall compares this to buying a small house at that time. Papyrologists have pointed out problems that come with calculating such numbers, so that we cannot rely completely on them, but to get a good impression of what dimensions we speak of when talking about the economics of Jerome's philological work, they certainly suffice. Jerome needed a lot of money just to keep the monasteries going, and we don't know if they actually produced anything, like meat, grains, etc. And Bagnall's numbers give us a good idea how big the numbers were that only the growing library devoured. It was an additional financial burden for the ascetic community. This famous passage might appear in a new light then. It may have well been true that lavish editions were not to the liking of Jerome's ascetic tastes, as Megan Williams assumes, but the real problem appears that they were simply too expensive for Jerome. He could not invest into the visual aesthetics of text, but rather into good copies, codices emendati, books that were produced with lots of care to avoid mistakes or illegibilities. Rufinus confirms this assumption in the passage we've already seen, that Jerome was willing to pay more for copies of Cicero's De Oratore. He says, Mercedes multulapiores. In fact, the wage of the writer, as we see on the table, was the biggest investment, as was shown by Bagnall's table, but one might assume now that the giant expenses caused by the constant acquisition of books for Jerome's library would be lowered when using monks as librari, but this can only be true partially. Often enough writers would have to be paid nonetheless. To examine this in depth, I would have to spend more time on examining who the monks in Jerome's monastery were and how skilled they could have been or become, but again I must shorten strictly. Jerome worked on text from different languages, not only Latin, but Greek too. There was the Septuagint, which he knew well and used often, but also Greek commentaries and other exegetical works. In his Praefatio to the book of Job, he tells the reader that he consulted Hebrew, Arabic, and Syriac manuscripts. Of course, he's aiming to impress as a polyglot and scholar, but his progressive philological methods suggest that he had in fact dealt with texts in these languages. This, however, required not only expensive manuscripts, but also teachers to learn the language. Furthermore, we know of hexapla, just as an example here, 6-column Bible editions with multiple translations and of monumental size. These texts may not have been available for borrowing, but would have to be copied, which again required much time, well-qualified external writers, and a lot of money. To sum up so far, Jerome most certainly had an institutionalized writing area with personnel in his monastery connected to his extensive library, which gave him an ideal working environment for his scholarly work. Unfortunately, all of this was very costly. Books and book production was a luxury and only affordable to rich people. In the long run, it was possible for Jerome to replace external scribes with monks from his monastery who he would train, especially to become Litterae, but his scholarly needs were so widespread that he always needed paid scribes from outside. How these matters would help Jerome gain authority as a church writer becomes only clear if one adds another part to the puzzle, the hospice for pilgrims in Bethlehem. Pilgrimage to the Holy Land appears to have become more popular over time during the 4th century. It became of interest to visit the places known from the Bible. Jerome himself spread the notion that it was a pars fide to visit Palestine, of course not without his own benefit in mind, as we shall see soon. One of these places of memory was Bethlehem, a certain cave in which Jesus supposedly had been born, and to see it was probably one of the highlights of such pilgrimages. Jerome took care to advertise it accordingly too, but the drawing power of the holy place per se was strong enough to build a dedicated building for pilgrims. The constant in and egress of pilgrims made the ascetic community more popular. People would come back and tell stories of the holy places they had visited, but also of the monks and nuns who lived there. Jerome mentions that people just came to see Paula, but the famous writer Jerome was celebrated too. One pilgrim we know was Egeria, who was so impressed by the sights of her pilgrimage that she described the monks she met in Palestine as digni, sancti, et vere religiosi. Just here are 2 examples here for sancti. Seen from this perspective, it turns out that the hospice was also a tool of propaganda to further Jerome's fame as a poor learned monk, also being the head of an ascetic community by the Praesepe Christi. To entertain a pilgrimage must have been an impossible project for the lower social classes. Therefore, one must assume pilgrims to be at least somewhat affluent or even outright wealthy. Jerome did not mind it. Of course, staying at the hospice was free, but visitors would certainly donate money to the monks who provided sustenance. Jerome offered many good arguments why rich people should give money to the pauperes Christi, such as himself, in the Holy Land, and that's another topic which I can't go on in detail here, but there's a lot of writing about that. And yes, around the year 400, there weren't many monasteries in the East which were led by Westerners. In fact, this fact, added to the importance of the location, makes it even more probable for Latin pilgrims to have put Bethlehem on the list of visits, the places to visit. When taking into account try. When taking into account Western pilgrims, it becomes even clearer why it had not been an option for Jerome's community to settle in Jerusalem. It was an urban center with a multitude of places of memory to the life and death of Jesus, but also the Old Testament. It was vastly superior to Bethlehem in terms of being a tourist attraction, so to say. But Melania and Rufinus had settled there some years earlier. Had Jerome also settled there too, he had been in a constant battle for VIP guests who would have to choose where to stay, and the Mount of Olives was hard to beat as it was the place where the return of Jesus was expected. Strategic considerations like these may have led to the decision to stay in the secluded Bethlehem. And the competition between the both Western communities was avoided, and all the pilgrims in Bethlehem were exclusively received by Jerome. The trick was to make sure pilgrims would actually come to Bethlehem. The majority of pilgrims will have probably brought back the expenses caused by the hospice. Truly wealthy and influential guests would give more and added non-monetary benefits. Ideally, they donated exorbitant sums in Bethlehem, which were used for the monastery and, as we have seen, to a large degree for the library and book production. But they would also become friends and patrons of Jerome, amici, who stayed connected to Jerome even after their return home and used their influence for Jerome's benefit. Furthermore, and this is where my deliberations about the book production come into play, Jerome could give them copies of his own works to take home. There, through the mode of circulation, these writings could be spread further and the influence of Jerome's teaching would grow. So at this point I could adduce a few more examples. Maybe I will try to go to them a bit more quicker, but basically I'm at the end. So I have a few examples which are, on one hand there's Paulinus of Nola. Maybe I read this example for you. When Paulinus of Nola asked Jerome in a letter of 394 to advise him on reading the Bible, he added that he was thinking about giving away all his possessions, and Jerome became excited and answered in a relatively extensive letter, Epistle 53, and invited him cordially to Bethlehem, obviis te manibus excipitiam. Robin Lane Fox has already suspected that Jerome was hoping for financial support to reproduce books, and he's certainly right. Soon, a second letter followed from Nola, brought by Vigilantius, who carried money and panegyrics as presents, and Paulinus then asked Jerome, okay, I'm certainly there, in a lost letter to write a commentary on Daniel in 399. This further strengthens the point that with the first two letters, both money and books were exchanged. So the other examples, I will cut most of it here. There's a Spaniard, Lucinus. He didn't come himself, but he sent a troop of monks, slaves to copy many books. And there was the very powerful Spaniard, Nummius Aemilianus Dexter, who also probably visited Jerome. I mean, of course, we don't know for sure, but scholars have suspected that a lot of money has been given to Bethlehem, and there's also Sulpicius Severus from Gaul, who didn't come himself, but his wealthy friend Postumianus was there, and he probably left a lot of money in Bethlehem too, and carried back writings. So, quick conclusion, all things considered, the choice of Bethlehem as a place for settlement was a strategically brilliant decision. It would attract rich benefactors, sometimes as pilgrims. Jerome now had monks who could copy books to an extent, so he could give some of his own works to visitors who became his friends and could spread his fame and writings. In short, Bethlehem, though on the periphery of the empire, was a fitting and eventually well-equipped base of operation for Jerome's fight to strengthen the ascetic movement in the church.